Hi. I didn't see you there. Today, I want to talk about structure. 1 minute. See, last month I kind of fell into an anime rabbit hole. And since then, I've watched a handful of short form series over the past month or so. And I noticed a strange similarity that is not just in the anime series themselves, but also in a handful of other short form content. So, what exactly do I mean by all of this? Well, I'm going to try and explain exactly what I mean, but I want to talk about how these shows chose to structure themselves and what we, as people who write and enjoy media, whether that be film, television, even something as simple as writing or painting, can learn from this and can apply it to our own work to hopefully get a desirable outcome, an improved outcome. I'm going to put a list up on the screen right now of all the different shows I'm going to be talking about, just in case you want to avoid spoilers for it. My point here is going to be to fully spoil them in order to talk about the way that they choose to structure their stories, so know that going in. All right, so let me talk about what I was doing last month. Last month, through a handful of recommendations, I ended up watching a show called Steins Gate, which is an anime from around 2011. It's a time travel story, but I noticed something very interesting in the way that the creators chose to structure the story. And that is, it's very distinctly split up into two separate halves. And not only is it set up into two different acts, which is very familiar, and we'll get into talking about all the different shows that use that kind of structure, but it's literally split more or less directly in half at about the halfway mark, taking a complete transformation. So for those that haven't seen it and don't care about the spoilers, it is about a wannabe mad scientist that ends up accidentally creating a time machine. And the first half of the show is set up very much as this slice of life drama. Them slowly discovering how the time machine works, becoming friends, the group coming together, using the time machine to correct people's lives, etc. It's nothing incredibly dramatic or special. It's exactly what it sounds like it is. It's a slice of life dramedy, essentially. Then about halfway through the show, Mayuri, one of the main characters and the person that's anchoring Okabe, our lead, to this world. He's a very flighty individual, ends up getting killed in a raid from CERN trying to reclaim this time machine or reappropriate this time machine. And the rest of the series, more or less, I'm going to get to the end in a second, is following our lead, Okabe, as he continually jumps back in time in this 48-hour, more or less, loop, trying to save Mayuri's life, and every time failing, falling to this kind of fate versus free will, can you really change anything, quantum break type questioning. The very end of the show kind of breaks away from this a little bit. In the last couple of episodes, he ends up actually saving Mayuri by undoing all the previous time travel they had done in that first half of the show. So, from a subtextual level, the second half of the show is literally deconstructing and undoing what was done in the first half of the show. And this is important. We're going to come back to this when we reference everything else to see how second acts can deconstruct the first acts that they present. The point being, in order to finally save Mayuri, he has to undo the very first time travel event, which was sending an email that ended up saving Kirisu, who is his love interest in the show's life. So he has to make this city on the edge of forever ethical dilemma of, is he willing to sacrifice the life of this woman that he loves for this person that has forever been in his life and is kind of his anchor to this world? He ends up choosing to undo that, and he literally ends up killing Kirisu. And the last couple of episodes are then the happy ending remedy to this, of finding a way to save both Mayuri and Kirisu. But that little last part, that third act, if you will, is still more or less part of the second act, because it's still part of undoing all the harm that the first act has done, that the time travel has done. So that's one example, and I really wanted to start with this because I want you to keep it in mind for two reasons. One is because it was the first one I watched in this little marathon of anime that I fell into last month. But second of all, it's because it literalizes what I think the thematic point of splitting these into these two different acts are. So another show I want to talk about is Kill la Kill and Gurren Lagann, which are both Trigger animated films, series, and they follow a very similar structure. Now, the interesting thing about Gurren Lagann is it has kind of almost a 3-act split. So I'm going to talk about that one first, also because it was just the next thing that I happened to watch last month. So Gurren Lagann follows a handful of characters, but there's kind of like this 3 trifecta that we follow, which is a little kid named Simon, his bro, Kamina, and this girl they pick up along the way, Yoko. And the first, I don't know what it is, 8 episodes is pretty simple like that. We build off of this core team. We have these 3 and we follow them, and that's who we're believing in, who we're trusting in the whole series, and we build off of that slowly. And then at about the 8th episode mark, more or less, Kamina is killed, and they have to go on without him. Simon, Yoko, and the whole Team Gurren that they've put together has to go on without him. So one could kind of see this as a split in the acts. Obviously, anytime a character as important as Kamina is to Gurren Lagann dies in a story, we should see it as this kind of split in the story. But the fact of the matter is, Gurren Lagann actually has a very different split that happens only about 5 episodes later. See, at the halfway point of the series, again, structurally looking, this is almost literally the halfway point of the series. We have a time skip 12 years into the future. And suddenly, the entire series is reframed. The first half of the series is about humans rising up from beneath the depths of the ground to fight the Spiral King. The second half of the series is a revelation as to why that was the case. It turns out that humanity are what are called spiral beings, and they possess spiral energy. And there's another race out there in the stars called the anti-spiral, who fear the spiral beings and wanted to keep them underground. So now that they have beat the Spiral King, overcome him, escaped, what should be triumphant and what could be considered the end of the anime, that is, we could have ended it at that halfway mark and been somewhat fulfilled. But what happens is that entire first struggle is then reframed as essentially a mistake. Because the anti-spiral are incredibly powerful, and it's not clear that Team Gurren is going to be able to defeat them. That's the entire thrust for the second half of the series, not to mention one of the characters that we really came to like is essentially taken over and killed by the anti-spiral. And we get a little bit more of a happy ending near the end, but that's essentially what happens. So what is the point of this one structurally? Well, I would argue it's exactly the same as what Steins Gate is trying to do, and that is it's trying to showcase how all our triumphs in the first half were really failures. And that is, in order to grow, both as a person and as a narrative, we need to undo the mistakes of the past. I think this is a very common theme that runs through these kind of 2-act structure stories. So I'm going to move on to the other trigger one so that we can kind of understand this as a duality between the two of them. And the other trigger one is Kill la Kill. Now, Kill la Kill is a weird show in general, both structurally and narratively. But what I want to talk about is, of course, the structure. The first half of Kill la Kill, or rather the first fourth, is set up kind of episodically. You can watch the first 4 or 5 episodes, and they're more or less just very episodical, as you would expect from an anime of the time or before the time. By the time you hit that 5th episode, and that's not the halfway point I want to talk about, but by the time you hit that 5th episode, you have this continual narrative thrust where each episode leads into the next episode, and that's going to continue for the rest of the series. That builds us up to when there is a big sports tournament, big arrival happening at Hanoche Academy, and that's where the actual turn of the show happens. See, what happens here is Lady Satsuki decides to turn against her mother, and it's revealed her true intentions. Now, this reframes the entirety of the show. We already had a slight reframement a few episodes earlier when it was revealed it's not Lady Satsuki who killed Ryuko's father, but this is a total switch. Why is that? Well, Lady Satsuki has been our antagonist for the entire series, and she's been built up as a really good antagonist for Ryuko. We've been given plenty of motivation not to like her, and plenty of reason to not trust her. So when it's revealed she's actually more or less on Ryuko's side, and it's revealed what exactly the plot was actually about in this crazy show, we're turned completely on our heads. And once again, we see the point of splitting it into this 2-act structure. By doing this, we've reframed the entirety of the first half. Now, if you go back and you rewatch the first half, you will have a completely different understanding of every character within, of not only of Lady Satsuki, but of the 4 powerful people at the school and of everyone else who is slowly slotting into the plan that Lady Satsuki has laid out. And we begin to understand more about the life fibers, which are the real villain of the show. And all of this is done through the 2-act structure, is done through a reframing of the first half by a second half that contradicts it, that second half that undoes it. Now, you need a certain length show to be able to do this. The next show I watched was Madoka Magica, which is a really short show. It's 9 episodes or 11 episodes or something. When your show is that short, it's kind of hard to do this 2-half reframing. You need this perfect middle. And Madoka does try to actually do this. There's a couple of points you could point to as this split reframing. Really, I think the simplest example is the first two episodes, again, being more or less a slice of life deliberation, and then the rest of the show being this just huge trauma dump. There's a handful of places you could point to, but I don't think there's ever a split in Madoka that makes it incredibly clear that our first half should be viewed with the context of the second half. And that is the secret to this 2-act structure. The second half has to give us more context and has to change the way we understood and the way we experienced the first half of the story. Now, obviously, this doesn't just happen in anime, but I want to stay on that for 1 second longer to talk about Evangelion. Now, Evangelion is one of those stories that is pervasive now. Everyone knows it, whether you know it or not. And it's been a long time since I watched the original Evangelion. At this point, we're going on 4-ish years. But if you'll remember with me, and I'm going to have to try and remember here, there is also that split in Evangelion. It happens, if I remember correctly, more or less around episode 16, which is slightly later than we've seen in some of these other shows, although more or less lines up with the same Gurren Lagann slit. What happens in Evangelion is also a little different. Instead of a reframement of the first half, it's more of a character transition, which is, of course, consistent with what the show was trying to do. We are transitioned from the exterior of the story, that is the literal robot fights, the end of the world, the characters' material lives, and we are transferred into the psychological ends of the story. That's why the last 4 or so episodes of Evangelion are so famous for not making a whole lot of sense. They're completely interior episodes. We have entered literally into the minds of the characters, and the exterior world, the material world, has lost its meaning and its value. That's a big theme going on in Evangelion, and it's a big reason for this shift. When Shinji attacks his friend, that's something he can't come back from. That's a trauma that is too much for him, and it pushes him into this interior space. And as Shinji is our anchor character, it pushes us with him into this interior space. We'll see the same thing happen to Asuka a few episodes later. And we begin to understand what exactly is going on with this show. See, the way Evangelion uses a 2-act structure is it uses its first act to set up the literals of the show, the material basis for the show. It's a show about giant robots fighting giant monsters. And it uses its second half to set up the thematics of the show, to answer that literal and material sense with what the show is actually about. And that is the characters, the psychology, what it means to be a person, and how we can be a person in such a strange and cruel world. That's the brilliant of Eva's 2X structure, and it's slightly different, but I think it's still getting at the same idea. It's rewriting our understanding of that first half as strictly material into only a guise for the psychological and thematic parts that are then answered in the second half of the show. Now, before I go, I know this is another long, weird rant here, but I want to show how this applies outside of strictly anime. Anime has been a good example for me here because a lot of them are limited short-form content. I think this is the area where this 2X structure works best, whether it's a limited miniseries or a really long movie. You can do it in film form, but I'm going to keep talking about these limited miniseries here. The first one is one of my favorites, which is Twin Peaks: The Return. Twin Peaks' third season is nuts. There's no denying that. And it's kind of hard to say it's split into two distinct halves. It's more like it's split into a million distinct halves. We could point to episode 8 as a turning point. But what I really want to talk about is pre-Return of Cooper, post-Return of Cooper. I think the return can be understood as Dougie Jones and Cooper. That might be a little reductive to a show that is so weird and complex. But in terms of my half structure, I think it's a good way to look at it. Why is that? Well, because once Cooper returns, the entire first half of the show, and not even the first half of just the return, but the first half of all of Twin Peaks seasons 1 and 2 and Fire Walk With Me, are entirely reframed. More or less, they're entirely reframed by the last episode of the show. And it's a bold way to do this 2x structure when you have an entire show, not even just the return, but the first 2 seasons and Fire Walk With Me, and then 1 episode, which is going to overwrite all of that. Now, if you've seen the return, you know how this works. It's David Lynch at his best. He gives us a final episode where Dale Cooper and Diane are transported seemingly to a different reality after trying to save Laura Palmer. And this reality is a lot crueler. It's our real world. When they go to the Palmer house, that is Dale Cooper and Laura, it's not the Palmer house. It's the house of the people that really live there. We have essentially exited out of the world of Twin Peaks and back into our world. It's a kind of way to usher us out of the fiction we've experienced, in the same way that films use end credits to wake the audience up and say, hey, we're back in the world, it's time to go. But it also does heavy lifting, reframing everything that we've seen before. Because everything we've seen before has been a television show. It's been a soap opera. It's been silly and absurd and scary, everything we would want from a story. And so that begins to make us question what it is we've watched. Something that does this on a less metafictional level is a recent miniseries made by Mike Flanagan called Midnight Mass. Now, again, it's been a little while since I've seen Midnight Mass, and I'm pulling this more or less out of my brain, so you'll have to forgive me here. But what happens about 3/4 through the runtime of Midnight Mass is our main character dies. Similar to Kamina, but in a very different way. The reason our main character in Midnight Mass dies is to have another main character realize what is happening in the story. The death of this one character serves a literal purpose of enlightenment and epiphany. And it also serves that structurally in the story. Because this is a huge turning point. This is where our main characters, the ones that are left, decide to take a stand against the vampire incursion into town. And it's a brilliant scene, a really painful way to end an episode, just watching one of our main characters fade into dust and the other one scream as they watch one of their closest friends die. What does Midnight Mass's 2-act structure serve to do here? Well, like I said, from a literal standpoint, it's an epiphany that drives the third act of the story forward. From a less literal standpoint, it's once again a reframing of the whole first act of the story. It makes us ask the question, if we hadn't been so stubborn, if we had listened or paid attention to the signs, would this character still be alive? That's the point I want to get at with this 2-act structure, and I think it's the way that you can use it in your own work, which is the Steins Gate way. I still think that Steins Gate is probably the best example of this 2-act structure because it literalizes what the structure is trying to do. Rewrite the mistakes of the past and frame them in a new context. The way a good 2-act structure works is not necessarily because of the twist itself, but because the twist itself allows us to go back and look at the first half of the narrative in a different way. Good narratives and good pieces of art are pieces of art that can be experienced more than once and elicit a different emotion at a different time. Now, there's a lot of ways to do this, and often you as the artist don't need to put any work in because the environment and experience we have is always going to be different. But something you can do to help out in this is to have a piece of art that literally reframes the experience when you go back and watch it again. That is the purpose of a good twist, and that's the purpose of this 2-act structure as well. The story changes because we have more context. That's true for any story, but it's especially true for a story that is trying to get us to understand the mistakes within the story itself. The fact that storytellers and stories are not perfect. They come from humans, and they're often about humans, whether literally or metaphorically. And we are not perfect beings. We're far from it. We are beings of constant mistakes. Understanding that is understanding how to tell a good story. I hope this video hasn't been too much of a nonsense rant for you. I promise next month I will get back to the actual structured, scripted videos. I'm just, again, out and about a lot and really busy. I wanted to throw this together so that I had something to release this month, and also so I could just reflect my thoughts on all this common structure I had seen in TV shows I've been watching recently. If you think I'm entirely wrong, please leave a comment. I am not an expert when it comes to TV. I've probably seen, 15 TV shows in my life. That's an understatement, but it has never been my expertise. I've always been a film and literature guy, and I do see these trends emerging in film and literature, but I do think they are best suited to the limited series or really long-form film content. I would like to see Kieślowski do something with this in Decalogue or something like that. But again, leave a comment about your own thoughts. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.